People think they know how this goes. The invisible girl saves a bleeding man, and he turns out to be a prince. Bullshit. Maeve found a dying man behind a diner, and 3 days later, the mob parked 30 black cars on her lawn. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was survival. The fryer grease at Denny's had a way of seeping into pores, colonizing hair and settling heavy in the lungs. By 2 a.m., Maeve didn't just smell like cheap burgers. She was the cheap burger. She leaned against the counter, shifting her weight from her left foot to her right. Her cheap orthopedic sneakers were losing the battle against the hard linoleum. The thick cotton of her uniform chafed against her inner thighs, a familiar, dull burn. She was 28, exhausted, and fat. Not curvy, not voluptuous. Fat. She carried her weight in a broad stomach, heavy arms and thick thighs. She took up space in a world that vastly preferred women who could fold themselves into neat, invisible little squares. Usually, her size made her a ghost to the late-night truckers and drunk college kids. They wanted their coffee refilled, not her life story. She preferred it that way. Invisibility was armor. "Maeve, take the trash out before you lock up," Dave muttered, not looking up from the register where he was counting out the meager till. She grabbed the heavy black bags, the plastic stretching over sharp corners of styrofoam and half-eaten ribs. The back door kicked open with a rusty squeal, letting in the damp, freezing October air of the alley. The smell of impending rain mixed with rotting vegetables. She heaved the first bag into the dumpster. It landed with a wet thud. She turned for the second. That was when she saw the shoe. It was a nice shoe. Italian leather. Completely ruined by the puddle of dark, viscous liquid pooling around it. She froze. The cynical voice in her head, the one that kept her alive in this grim, rusting city, screamed at her to drop the garbage, go inside, lock the heavy steel door, and call the cops. But her feet didn't move. She took a step closer, the gravel crunching under her rubber soles. He was slumped against the brick wall, half hidden by a stack of broken wooden pallets. His head hung low, chin resting on his chest. A dark wool overcoat hid most of the damage, but she could hear the wet, rattling sound of his breathing. A shadow in the dark. "Hey," she said, her voice barely a croak. "Hey, buddy. You alive?" He didn't answer, but his head lolled to the side. The faint yellow light from the street lamp caught his face. He was pale, deathly pale. Dark hair plastered to a sweaty forehead, blood trailing from the corner of his mouth. He wasn't a junkie looking for a fix, and he wasn't a drunk who took a wrong turn. He looked like money, and he looked like violence. She stepped closer, her heavy boots splashing in the puddle. It wasn't water. The copper smell hit the back of her throat, thick and metallic. Blood. So much blood. He opened his eyes. They were dark, entirely unfocused, blown wide with shock and pain. His hand twitched toward the inside of his coat, a defensive instinct, but he didn't have the strength. His fingers curled uselessly against the wool. "Leave it," he rasped. The words were more blood than breath. She should have called the police. But she looked at his suit, at the defensive reach for a gun that wasn't there, and she knew the police would just be the middleman to a morgue. "You're bleeding out," she said, stating the obvious. Astute. A bitter, broken half-smile. Then his eyes rolled back, and he slumped sideways, hitting the wet pavement. She stood there for 3 seconds. 3 seconds of choosing between the quiet, invisible life she had and the utter chaos bleeding at her feet. She sighed, a heavy, exhausted sound, and bent down. He was a big man, lean but packed with dense muscle. Dead weight. A smaller woman would have had to leave him there. A smaller woman couldn't have done what she did next. She wedged her arms under his armpits. The strain pulled at her shoulders, her back protesting instantly. She gritted her teeth, planted her wide stance, and pulled. Her thighs burned. She hauled him backward, inch by agonizing inch, out of the puddle of his own blood. "Come on, you heavy bastard," she muttered, sweat breaking out on her forehead. Her beat-up Honda was parked 20 feet away. It took her 10 minutes to get him there. By the time she managed to open the rear door and shove him onto the faded upholstery, she was gasping for air, her heart hammering against her ribs. She shoved his legs in, slamming the door just as a set of headlights swept across the far end of the alley. She dropped to the ground, her chest heaving, pressing her heavy frame against the cold metal of her car door. A black SUV rolled slowly past the alley entrance. It didn't stop. It just cruised by, a shark in dark water. When the taillights faded, she climbed into the driver's seat. Her hands were shaking, leaving bloody fingerprints on the plastic steering wheel. She put the car in drive. She was taking a ghost home. Her apartment was a ground-floor unit in a dilapidated duplex on the edge of the industrial district. The rent was cheap because the trains rattled the windows twice a night, and the landlord didn't ask questions. Getting him inside was worse than getting him into the car. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a deep, aching fatigue. She dragged him through the front door, leaving a faint crimson smear on the cheap linoleum floor, right into the narrow bathroom. She dropped him on the bath mat. She locked the front door, pulled the shades down tight, and went back to the bathroom with a pair of trauma shears she'd kept from a brief, failed stint in nursing school, a bottle of rubbing alcohol, and a roll of duct tape. She knelt beside him. The space was tiny. Her hips bumped against the edge of the porcelain tub. She cut his shirt open, ruining what was probably $1,000 worth of silk and wool. There were 2 holes. One in his lower left abdomen, clean through. The exit wound in his back was messy, but the bullet hadn't stayed inside. The second was a graze along his ribs, shallow but bleeding sluggishly. He groaned as she poured the alcohol directly onto the stomach wound. His body convulsed violently, arching off the floor. "Hold still," she snapped, pressing a thick wad of gauze against the bleeding flesh. Her heavy weight was an advantage here. She leaned into it, pinning him down with her forearm while she applied pressure. His eyes snapped open. The haze was gone, replaced by a sharp, feral panic. His left hand shot out, wrapping around her throat. His grip was weak, trembling, but the intent was lethal. He stared up at her, trying to orient himself. He saw the stained bathroom tiles, the rusty faucet, and then he looked at her. He looked at her double chin, the sweat dripping from her round face, the bloody Denny's apron still tied around her wide waist. He didn't see a threat. He saw a tired waitress. His hand fell away from her throat, hitting the floor with a thud. "Where?" "My bathroom," she said, keeping her voice flat. She didn't reach for her neck, though her skin crawled where he had touched her. "You were dying by my dumpster. I didn't want to explain it to the health inspector." He let out a short, breathy laugh that turned into a wet cough. "You should have called an ambulance. You look like a guy who considers hospitals to be an occupational hazard," she replied. She reached over the duct tape, tearing off a long strip with her teeth. "Sit up. I need to tape the gauze over the exit wound." He tried. He really did. He managed to lift his shoulders an inch before collapsing. "Right," she muttered. She leaned over him, wrapping her thick arms around his torso, hoisting his upper body up. She smelled like grease. He smelled like expensive cologne and copper. She slapped the gauze to his back and secured it with 3 tight bands of duct tape, wrapping it all the way around his waist. When she laid him back down, he was unconscious again. She spent the next hour cleaning the blood off the floor and herself. She managed to drag him out of the bathroom and onto the lumpy sofa in the living room. She threw a cheap fleece blanket over him, set a glass of water on the milk crate she used as a coffee table, and sat in the armchair opposite him. She watched him breathe. His face was sharp, aristocratic. High cheekbones, a strong jaw shadow with dark stubble. He looked like the kind of man who walked into a room and owned it. The kind of man who never looked twice at a woman like her, unless she was pouring his coffee. Over the next 2 days, they settled into a strange, tense purgatory. He spent the first 36 hours burning with a fever. She spooned water past his chapped lips, changed the bloody gauze, and fed him crushed Tylenol. On the second evening, the fever broke. She was sitting at her tiny kitchen table, eating leftover meatloaf from a Tupperware container, when he spoke. "It's loud." She looked up. He was awake, his dark eyes tracking the vibrations of the freight train rattling past her back window. "You get used to it," she said. She took another bite of her food. She didn't apologize for eating, didn't try to hide her appetite. She was too old and too tired to perform performative daintiness. He slowly pushed himself up into a sitting position, wincing as the duct tape pulled at his skin. He looked around her apartment. It was small, cluttered, but clean. "Why am I here?" he asked. His voice was deeper now, a gravelly baritone that vibrated in the small room. "Because you bled on my nice garbage bags." He stared at her. It wasn't the look of a man who was disgusted, nor was it the look of a man who was attracted. It was a cold, calculating assessment. He was taking her measure. "I'm Keo," he said finally. "Maeve. You're a very strong woman, Maeve." It wasn't a compliment about her character. It was a factual observation of her physical strength. He remembered her dragging him, pinning him. "Gravity and mass," she replied dryly. "Don't flatter me." He leaned back against the cheap cushions. "I owe you my life." "You owe me a new bath mat. I had to throw the other one out." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Why didn't you call the police?" She set her fork down, wiping her mouth with a paper towel. "Because I don't like cops. They don't look out for people in my tax bracket. And you look like you like them even less." Keo watched her for a long time. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with things unsaid. She knew what he was. You don't live in this city without knowing the shadows that run it. He was mob, cartel, something dangerous. And she had brought him into her home. "You shouldn't have saved me, Maeve," he said quietly. "I'll remember that for next time." He closed his eyes, his head resting against the back of the sofa. "There are people looking for me. People who want to finish the job. Are they going to find you here?" "No," he sounded certain. "I ditched my phone in the alley. They don't know this place. They don't know you." She nodded slowly, picking her fork back up. "Good. Because I have a double shift tomorrow, and I can't afford to get shot." He didn't laugh this time. He just watched her finish her meal. It was the first time in her life she had felt someone's eyes on her without feeling the familiar sting of judgment. He wasn't looking at a fat waitress. He was looking at a lifeline. But Keo was wrong about one thing. The next morning, she woke up to the sound of low, rumbling engines. It wasn't the train. She walked to the front window, pushing back the edge of the curtain just a fraction of an inch. Her breath hitched in her throat. Parked along the cracked pavement of her street, stretching down the block in both directions, was a line of black SUVs. Dozens of them. The engines purred in unison, a mechanical growl that vibrated through the floorboards. She looked back at the sofa. Keo was already awake, He was holding her kitchen knife, his face carved from stone. "You said they wouldn't find you," she whispered, the cynicism finally breaking, letting the fear bleed through. Keo slowly stood up, grimacing in pain, the knife gleaming in the dim morning light. "I underestimated them." He looked at her, a dark promise in his eyes. "Stay behind me." The exhaust from 30 identical engines plumed into the damp morning air, a thick white fog rolling over the cracked pavement. Car doors opened in a synchronized metallic wave. Men stepped out. They weren't cops. Cops wore cheap polyblend uniforms and carried a bored, bureaucratic authority. These men wore dark wool coats, their hands tucked casually into their pockets. They moved with a terrifying, predatory silence. Maeve looked at Keo. He was gripping her kitchen knife, his knuckles bone white against the cheap plastic handle. The duct tape binding his ribs creaked as his chest rose and fell. "If they wanted to kill me, they would have thrown a flashbang through the window 10 seconds ago," he said, his voice a low, raspy scrape. "Open the door, Maeve." "I have a broken toaster and a half-empty can of pepper spray. I'm not opening my door to the mafia." "Open it," he repeated softly, "before they take it off the hinges. It's my people." She swallowed hard. She walked to the front door, her worn orthopedic shoes feeling entirely inadequate for the moment. She flipped the deadbolt. It unlocked with a loud, pathetic click. She barely stepped back before the heavy wood swung open. 3 men filled her narrow entryway. The air in her apartment instantly turned thick with the scent of cold rain, expensive tobacco, and gun oil. The man in the center was older, his silver hair swept back neatly. His slate-gray suit probably cost more than her car. He looked at the peeling paint on her walls, the stained linoleum, and finally at her. His eyes swept over her broad frame, her unwashed hair, the grease-stained T-shirt she slept in. He didn't look at her with disgust. He looked at her like she was a piece of slightly defective furniture blocking his path. Then his gaze shifted to the living room. To Keo. "Christ, Keo, you look like a butcher's block," the older man exhaled. Keo tossed the knife onto the milk crate. It landed with a clatter. "Good to see you too, Arthur." Arthur stepped inside, his 2 massive shadows following close behind. Her apartment was suddenly suffocatingly small. She backed up against the kitchen counter, crossing her thick arms over her chest, pulling her heavy frame tight. She was acutely aware of how much space she took up. For the first time in her life, she wished she could fold herself into the drywall and disappear. "We've been tearing the city apart," Arthur said, his eyes evaluating the bloody gauze strapped to Keo's back. "The Corsettis hit the convoy. When we didn't find your body in the alley, I thought you were in the river." "I had help," Keo said. Arthur looked at her again. He reached inside his coat. She flinched, expecting a gun. Instead, he pulled out a thick, banded stack of $100 bills, setting it on the counter next to her elbow. "For your trouble," Arthur said smoothly. "And your silence. Buy yourself something nice." She stared at the money. It was a ticket out, and looking at it made her stomach turn over in a hot, sudden wave of anger. "Take it off my counter," she said flatly. Arthur blinked. "Excuse me." "I didn't drag him out of a dumpster for a tip," she said, holding on to her anger because it kept the terror at bay. "I work for tips at the diner. This is a bribe to pretend I didn't see the mob bleeding on my bath mat. Take it back." One of the massive men behind Arthur shifted, his hand dipping toward his waist. "Leave her alone, Arthur." Keo's voice cracked through the room like a whip. Even broken on a thrift store sofa, he commanded the space. The man froze. Arthur smoothly pocketed the money. "Fine. The car is waiting, Keo. We have a doctor at the compound." Keo nodded slowly. He looked at her. "Pack a bag, Maeve." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "No, you got your ride. My shift starts at noon. I'm taking a shower." Keo pushed himself off the sofa. He swayed, his face draining of color, but he stayed on his feet. He walked toward her until he was standing a foot away. She had to tilt her head back to look him in the eye. "The Corsettis hit me, and they missed," Keo rumbled. "They're going to trace the blood in that alley. They'll pull traffic cams. They'll find the rusted-out Honda that drove away, and they'll find this address. If you stay here, Maeve, you won't make it to your noon shift. You'll be dead by 11. The cold reality of his words washed over her. Her invisibility was gone. She looked at her cramped, dingy kitchen. It wasn't much, but it was hers. 5 minutes, she muttered. She walked into her bedroom and pulled a worn canvas duffel bag from the closet. What does a woman who owns nothing pack for the end of the world? She packed 2 Denny's uniforms, thick socks, sensible underwear, her toothbrush, and a framed photograph of her mother. Her entire life fit into a $12 thrift store bag. Arthur's men had already supported Keo out the door. She locked her apartment, knowing with a sinking certainty she would never turn that key again. She climbed into the back of a black armored Suburban. The leather smelled of rich hide and expensive chemicals. She sat awkwardly, her wide hips pressing against the contoured seats, her thick thighs spreading out. She clamped her knees tightly together, holding her duffel bag on her lap like a shield. Keo sat next to her, a medical kit already open on his lap as Arthur injected something into his arm. As the convoy pulled away from the curb, leaving her crumbling neighborhood behind, Keo's hand dropped to the seat between them. His knuckles briefly brushed against her heavy thigh. It wasn't a caress. It was an anchor, a silent promise that in the storm to come, he wouldn't let her drown. The compound was 20 miles outside the city limits, hidden behind wrought-iron gates and sprawling skeletal oaks. The house itself was a massive stone fortress, beautiful in a cold, brutal way. For the first 4 days, she was a ghost again, just in a much more expensive graveyard. They gave her a room on the 3rd floor. It was the size of her entire apartment, dominated by a king-sized bed, with sheets so high count they felt like water. She hated it. She missed the rumble of the freight trains. Here, the silence was heavy, oppressive. It felt like a trap waiting to spring. She spent most of her time sitting in a velvet armchair by the window, wearing her Denny's uniform because she refused to touch the silk robes they had left in the closet. Meals were brought to her by silent, sharp-eyed men in suits. She ate everything they brought, wiping the plates clean. She wasn't going to starve, and she wasn't going to perform delicacy for the mob. On the 5th night, the quiet finally broke her. It was 2:30 a.m. Her body was still wired for the graveyard shift. She left her room, walking barefoot down the sweeping, carpeted hallway. She navigated the labyrinth of the mansion until she found the kitchen. It was an industrial marvel of stainless steel and black granite. The lights were dim, but she wasn't alone. Keo was sitting at the massive island. He wore dark slacks and a white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his thick forearms. He looked healed, though he favored his left side slightly. The pale, dying man from her bath mat was completely gone. In his place was a man forged from violence and cold authority. He was nursing a crystal glass of amber liquid. He didn't turn around, but he spoke as she stepped onto the tile. "The floor is cold. You should wear slippers." "I don't have slippers," she said, her voice sounding unnecessarily loud in the cavernous room. She walked over and sat on the stool next to him. It creaked under her weight. She placed her thick forearms on the cool granite counter. Keo reached for a second glass, poured 2 fingers of whiskey and slid it toward her. Drink. It helps with the quiet. She took a sip. It burned like hellfire going down, leaving a smoky, rich warmth in her chest. When can I leave? She asked, staring at the melting ice in her glass. You can't. The finality in his voice sparked her temper. I'm not a pet, Kyo. You said your people would handle the guys who shot you. Are they handled? Most of them, he said calmly, swirling his drink. The ones who matter. Then I want to go home. Kyo finally turned to look at her. His dark eyes were unreadable. They scanned her face, dropping to the broad shelf of her chest, the thick curve of her waist under the cotton uniform, before meeting her eyes again. You don't have a home anymore, Maeve. The Corsettis burned your apartment building to the ground yesterday morning. The air punched out of her lungs. She gripped the edge of the granite counter, her knuckles turning white. The peeling paint, the rattling windows, her mother's handmade Afghan on the sofa. Gone, reduced to ash because she decided to be a decent human being for 10 minutes. A heavy, suffocating panic rose in her throat. She couldn't breathe. Her hand started to shake. Suddenly, Kyo's hand clamped down over hers. His grip was entirely different from the weak, trembling hand that had grabbed her throat in the bathroom. This was iron. Solid, warm, and utterly immovable. Breathe, he commanded gently. I have nothing, she gasped, the cynical armor cracking, letting a hot, humiliating tear slip down her round cheek. I have no money, no job. I am nothing. You are not nothing, Kyo said, his voice dropping to a fierce, low register. He stood up from his stool, stepping into her space, forcing her to look at him. Look around this house, Maeve. Look at the men guarding the doors. Every person in my life is starving. They are skeletal, hungry things, gnawing on each other for a scrap of power. They look at me, and all they see is what they can tear off my bones. He reached out, his rough thumb brushing away the tear on her cheek. He didn't shy away from the flesh of her jaw, the fullness of her face. His hand was large enough to hold her, and for the first time, she didn't feel monstrous. She felt solid. You didn't look at me and see a meal, he said quietly. You saw a bleeding man, and you calculated exactly how much weight you could carry. You didn't ask for a reward. You just hauled me out of the dirt. She swallowed hard. I wanted you to stop bleeding on my floor. A stark, startlingly beautiful smile broke across his face. And you achieved that. He stepped closer, standing between her spread knees. His hands moved down to rest heavily on her thick waist. The heat of his palms bled through the cheap cotton of her uniform. It was a possessive touch, but it wasn't a cage. I can't send you back to the city. My enemies know you saved me. That makes you a target, but it also makes you mine to protect, Kyo murmured, his face inches from hers. I don't belong in this world, she whispered. No, Kyo agreed softly, his thumbs tracing the wide curve of her hips. You don't. You're too real for it, which is exactly why I'm never letting you go. He didn't kiss her. The moment didn't call for a fairy tale ending. He pressed his forehead against hers, his weight grounding her in the terrifying, chaotic new world she had been dragged into. She was 28. She was fat. She was tired, and for the first time in her life, she was absolutely, terrifyingly visible. As Kyo's hands tightened on her waist, holding her like she was the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth, she knew she wasn't going to be collateral damage. She was the anchor. That's the end of Maeve and Kyo's beginning. She thought she was invisible, but to a man tired of a starving world, she was the most real thing he'd ever seen. Would you survive the mob underground? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. If you loved this gritty mafia romance, smash that like button and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next dark, grounded story.